coffee series. We are very honored to have two distinguished evaluators and people from a very credible office, the Independent Evaluation Office of the GEF, Juha Uitto, the director, and Geeta, Batra, the deputy, who will share with us thoughts on a very important publication that was just being released, Transformational Change for People and Planet. At our office, we also are very pleased with this because we managed to get some of our people would have chapters in it, but it is a collection of essays that will lead to important debate around the topic of how do we begin to bring about harmony between people and the planet, given the devastation that has happened and continues to happen with regards to climate change and related aspects. So without further ado, I hand over to Juha and Geeta to take us through a presentation, and then we will have an opportunity for any questions and comments. Thank you, Juha. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Indran. And let me just put on my timer here so that I don't go too far. But it's thanks very much for inviting us here to talk about this new book. And it's good to see all of you and several familiar faces and names on the screen. So let me start with an introduction, and then Geeta will come along. I don't know how maybe you should put that, Geeta, the presentation into a slideshow mode. So this is the book that we are talking about. It was published quite recently by Springer as an open access book. So you can download it in its totality or just select chapters free of charge. Of course, we will have no objections if you prefer to purchase it in, so that you'll have it in your bookshelf on a prominent place. You can just go to the Springer's website and search our names, and it'll show up. And there's a link to the open access version. The book is an outgrowth of the third conference on evaluating environment and development that we organized in Prague in October 2019. As an observant listener would notice that there's the word third, which might suggest that there were actually two earlier conferences as well. The first one was organized in Alexandria, Egypt in 2008 by my predecessor at the GEF, Rob van den Berg. And that was, to my knowledge, the first gathering on this topic or a related topic. I was fortunate to attend that conference when I was at UNDP's IEO at that point of time. The second conference was held in Washington, D.C. in October 2014, when Rob was actually passing the baton to me. And both of these conferences were defined more narrowly as evaluating climate change and development, whereas this third conference, for that we expanded the scope to the environment more broadly, and it'll become obvious why we did that. So all of these three gatherings resulted in books, but none of them is a proceedings per se. The model we used in each case was to invite the speakers who made the most interesting and innovative presentations at the conference to develop their ideas to a full-fledged chapter, which was then peer-reviewed internally to ensure rigor and that it would contribute to the overall theme. Like Indran already mentioned, there is a strong Ifad connection here. Rob and I co-edited the second book together with Joe Puri, actually, who is now in Ifad, although not in evaluation. This current book has two chapters based on Ifad's evaluation work, one by Prashanth Kotturi and another one by Nanti and his team about the recent Ifad climate adaptation evaluation. As a side, I'd like to commend that evaluation. I think that the evaluation is really an excellent piece of work in terms of its approach and methodology, its comprehensiveness of analysis, and the constructive manner in which it points to the lessons and a way forward. Oh, and obviously I shouldn't forget that the very first chapter conceptual chapter after my introduction in this particular book is by none other than Indran himself. The book is organized into a number of themes that also guided the conference. The overall theme is transformational change, and I acknowledge that this is a bit of a buzzword these days. But it's a buzzword for a good reason, given the state of the world we're living in now. Climate change is now a reality, as we know, and we live its impacts in our daily lives, with wildfires, heat waves, and other weather anomalies that affect not only the poor countries, but all countries in the world. Apparently, Eastern Australia is currently experiencing unprecedented flooding. The IPCC has just earlier this week come out with its new report, which is telling us that climate change impacts are actually happening faster than previously expected. But climate change, of course, is just a part of the story. Loss of habitat, species, and ecosystem integrity is happening faster than ever before, at least since humans have been around. And pollution of air, water, soils, oceans continues unabated. The world is literally drowning in waste. The pandemic itself is a manifestation of how closely related environmental health and human health are. These kinds of spillovers of zoonotic viruses from non-human animals to humans are getting more frequent as a consequence of our increasing encroachment into and abuse of nature. At the same time, we know poverty remains a massive problem and inequality has been growing steadily worldwide. So we do need transformational change if we are to move the needle towards more sustainability. And Geeta will talk a little bit more about how we approach the issue of transformation in our evaluative work. What all these processes that I mentioned have in common is that they are caused by human activity and its ever-expanding scope and extent. Economic growth demands energy and natural resources, which in turn cause climate change and environmental degradation. Your domain is agriculture, which is obviously essential to feeding the world's population that is still growing by some 83 million people every year. Our production and consumption habits require increasing amounts of land, water, and chemicals. And of course, there are still a couple of billion people in the world whose consumption levels in terms of food and otherwise are too low to allow for a decent living. So having said that, agriculture is one of the main drivers of environmental degradation. Because of more forest is cleared for agriculture and large amounts of chemicals are used. Industrial agriculture is, of course, the worst culprit, but smallholder agriculture is not blameless either. In fact, 3 commodities that are ubiquitous in our daily lives are responsible for almost 80% of tropical deforestation: soybeans, beef, and palm oil. Consequently, the second part of the book focuses on the drivers of sustainability. The GEF strategy over the past several years has shifted from addressing the symptoms and dealing with environmental problems in isolation to focusing on the root causes behind unsustainability. So instead of just managing protected areas or promoting renewable energy, it is important to take a more holistic look at systems. Be it deforestation or illegal wildlife trade, it is essential to understand what drives the processes and at what level. Sustainability is often vertically integrated across scales. When we deal with, say, agricultural commodities, we need to look at the entire chain from the smallholders doing the primary production through marketing, trade, and distribution, all the way to the consumer. The third section of the book is more explicitly about evaluating climate change. The 5 chapters in this section cover both mitigation and adaptation, and this is where we also have the chapter based on the Ifad adaptation evaluation, highlighting in particular the innovative work it did in evidence review. The final section of the book then deals with various evaluation approaches. So overall, some of the main conclusions for evaluation that arise from the book as a whole emphasize the importance of evaluators taking a holistic view. This means first that we have to remember that every intervention takes place in a broader context, and that context matters. We did a series of evaluations focusing on LDCs, SIDS, and fragile and conflict-affected situations, respectively. They showed that each group has its own specificities and have an impact on project performance and outcomes. Every intervention interacts with other elements and properties of the system, be it policies, markets, social organization, other interventions, and so forth. It would thus be meaningless to evaluate an intervention just through its internal logic, checking the boxes on whether the project did what it set out to do. Evaluation must see the intervention in the broader context and see whether it made a difference to the problem it sought to address. In the field where we work, the impacts of interventions often just end up being undone by other contradicting forces. You may work on environmental restoration, but if government policies directly or indirectly encourage deforestation, your work may not make much of a difference. That is why, again, the GEF has moved towards addressing the drivers. Promoting policy coherence is essential. Secondly, evaluation, like programming, must consider both human and natural systems. If you only look at one or the other, it's impossible to achieve sustainable development. I don't mean environmental projects either here per se, but especially interventions in other areas, as it is fair to assume that anything and everything we do has some environmental consequences. These can be positive or more often negative, intended or frequently unintended. So it is essential for evaluations to pay close attention to unintended consequences. That means that you will have to look beyond the direct ambit of the project. By definition, if these effects are unanticipated, they won't feature in the project's theory of change. Therefore, the theory of change must be expanded. Finally, we are great proponents of mixed methods and approaches. There is no such thing as a global standard for evaluation other than using the most suitable methods for the question at hand, tailored to the availability and type of data. So in our field, it's often possible to use geospatial methods, including remote sensing data. But it's also important to know what happens on the ground and why. So there are where other methods, including qualitative methods, come to play equally importantly. So that's my spiel, and with this I'd like to pass the word on to Geeta. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Juha. Thanks, Indran and Ifad, for inviting us. Very quickly, the word transformational change is used throughout the book, but I just wanted to start with a quick definition that we use: deep systemic sustainable change with large-scale impact in an area of global environmental concerns. So what we did is we took the work that had been done by IEG, we expanded the framework to make it more relevant to environmental projects. I'm not going to go into this chart in detail, but just to highlight that there are internal factors, there are contextual conditions, the ambition level really matters, and of course, the relevance and outcomes and sustainability. And we've technically applied this framework throughout all the evaluations that we've been doing since we developed this paper and methodology. Before I get into some examples, because even though we've not brought these out particularly in the book, I just thought since we're doing this presentation at IFAD, I should focus a little bit on projects that are pretty close to transformational change in the IFAD context and in the Ifad portfolio. What does the Ifad GEF portfolio look like today? This is based on terminal evaluations. You've seen that the number of multifocal projects that cut across the different focal areas of the GEF have been increasing over time. And the results have also been improving. You have about 66 to 67% as satisfactory in terms of outcomes and sustainability, slightly lower than the overall GEF average, which is now closer to about 77 to 80%. but it has been improving over time. And as you know, IFAD is also doing a lot of the global programs, part of the GEF's shift towards integration. I wanted to take a couple of examples and focus on the chapter on transformational change and scaling up in the context of this book. And there's an example of an IFAD project scaled up that was sustainable land management in Ethiopia. And basically IFAD's interventions were mainly in improving land tenure, increasing agricultural productivity, and of course, alternative income generating activities. So you noticed a lot of environmental outcomes. You had reduced erosion, increased vegetation cover, increased carbon storage, and improved livelihoods of over 430,000 rural beneficiaries, especially women and landless youth. And of course, the land degradation was reduced, and you had a lot of improved land brought under land management from 86,000 hectares to roughly 800,000, almost a tenfold increase. So what were some of the lessons that came out of this project in IFAD that we saw? Success starts at the design stage. There was individual and institutional capacity building. There were the right incentives given to the communities. You had sustainable financing mechanisms, long-term vision for scaling up in Ethiopia. It was designed for scale up right from the very get-go, and also designed to address barriers and motivations, because there was land in tenure insecurity was a key barrier to investing in SLM practices. And then above all, it was actually designed both for environmental and socioeconomic co-benefits. So it not only addressed land degradation and land productivity, but also poverty and food insecurity. The other project I wanted to highlight was the sustainable land management in Brazil. This was actually part of our study also on innovation, where you had very good technological and financial innovations designed in this project. It was a participatory approach. There was a lot of mainstreaming through policy changes at the federal level. In fact, this was a big follow-up done by IFAD, where initially the project didn't have much traction throughout the country, but when IFAD came in and actually mainstreamed the policy changes at the federal level is when the project got replicated and scaled up tremendously. There was knowledge sharing, capacity building, of course, government ownership, and above all, sustainable financing. The biggest financial innovation was actually a fund, an environmental fund that was set up, and the project attracted about $65 million just in co-financing through other bank investors as well as the private sector. The one big factor behind the success was the participatory approach. Now, not everything always works. And one thing we found is it's not enough to just innovate, right? So there have been projects that have just focused on technological innovation or financial innovation. And this is a case of the irrigation technology pilot project in Jordan, where it was very innovative in terms of the irrigation technology. It targeted poor smallholder farmers, and it was really good in terms of generating efficiency in the use of water resources. But the project didn't do so well, and was not really leading on the path to transformational change. And that's primarily because it didn't have the participation of all the small scale farmers. It had a co-financing requirement, for example, of 25%. That was just way too high for small farmers. The relatively wealthier farmers could, of course, co-finance, but not the others. So the high co-financing requirements, unrealistic, and the exclusion led to a not so successful outcome for this project. So clearly we've seen, and this has been articulated throughout the book, success factors for transformational change. You've got to have clear ambition and design from the get-go. And we see this in innovative projects, transformative projects, scaled up projects. You've got to address key market failures through policy change. Policy and regulatory reform are really important. And this is one reason why through UNEG, we're actually doing a study on how policy influence takes place through UN organizations and UN interventions, and what realistic frameworks, evaluation frameworks can be used, because, for example, in a fragile and conflict affected state, you may not get the same outcome of a key regulatory reform in a period of time like you would get in a very stable environment, but their processes bringing people to the table for discussion clearly matter. So results frameworks need to be more flexible when you're operating in different contexts. And this is what Juha was mentioning. This book talks a lot about country context. Mechanisms for financial sustainability are key and need to be planned from the get-go. Of course, quality of implementation and execution. And the more important factor is actually you can achieve this by projects of different sizes. It's not necessary that you need large-scale resources. We've seen a lot of successful transformative projects that are actually medium-sized by GEF standards, which is under the $2 million limit. And finally, it's quite similar to take a pilot project, scale it up for transformational change. You've got to have your key stakeholders, you've got to have government buy-in, using the right influencers. If you don't have government buy-in, you're setting up for failure, right? And then sustained support. And a big factor was actually learning for change, learning and knowledge sharing, in addition to capacity building and policy reform. So I will stop there. And we will take questions. Indran, I'm sure you have stuff to add based on your, piece that you've also written.
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Chapter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juha and Geeta, for congratulations on this extremely timely publication that is going to stimulate debate globally, because it's gone through the networks, and also being open access is good. I think the point that I make in my chapter is that there's a relativism around the word transformation, and it has become a buzzword. And what is transformative in one context is not necessarily in another. And one needs to be very sensitive about using these words too loosely, because it oftentimes conveys something that's dramatic when it may not be that dramatic. So, that is the point we made. And of course, I drew on examples from work at land reform, the Public Service Commission of South Africa, and UNDP to draw out some of these issues. But, I would encourage all the participants to read the book closely. There's a lot you can learn from, and it'll open new vistas in terms of your perspectives. But also, congratulations again from our office, Nanthi and Prashanth, for the important contributions they made in this book. We're very grateful. So, colleagues, I'll stop here and give the floor open for comments and reactions, and then we give a chance to our guests to respond. So we've got Nanthi first, followed by Fabrizio.
Okay. Thank you so much, Juha and Geeta, for first making this book an open access book, which makes a big difference in terms of accessibility. And also thanks for the kind words, Juha, about the evaluation and the opportunity to present our contributions in this part of our contributions in this book. So thank you. I just have, I fully agree with the presentation that you made, particularly in need of a holistic approach and the need for all evaluations, particularly in the agricultural sector, to look at human system, ecosystem nexus. And also related to that, focus not only on the stated goals and intentions of the project, but also what are the full consequences that are occurring in through your intervention. Specifically, given that the agricultural sector is pretty anthropocentric, and therefore, how do you beat that? How do you propose offsets? How do you propose win-win solutions where environmental and climate and economic resilience can be built together in interventions? Because governments are always asking, okay, bottom line is dollar. If you show us profitability or livelihood improvement for the farmers, and then evaluation's job is to be able to highlight these areas where we can have either win-win solutions or where we can provide offsets. One thing that I noticed was, this is an observation which I would like your comments on. While we were doing this evaluation, there were a number of other evaluations that also were looking at climate adaptation, GCF, ADB, Food and Agricultural Organization, Adaptation Fund, and so on. I did not find much evidence for this this analysis that you are proposing, holistic analysis, human ecosystem nexus, unintended consequences, and so on and so forth. And for instance, ADB is infrastructure mainly, but even in infrastructure, our evaluation finds that there could be unintended consequences to ecosystem. What are your thoughts on that? And how would you like, how is there a systematic effort? What kind of collaboration can Ifad, GEF, and others can have to build a knowledge base where we point out to solutions which are win-win and also provide viable offsets when the win-win is not possible? Over.
Thanks, Nanthi. We'll take Fabrizio and then Max and give a chance for presenters to respond. We also got people from Ifad present, so please feel free to ask questions or make comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Indran, and of course, thanks to Juha and to Geeta for the presentation. Mine is not a question or comment, it's just an acknowledgement of the importance of this book as a reference. We have prepared a new evaluation manual for IFA, which is going to be used by both self-evaluation, so management, and independent evaluation, so IOE. And we are introducing new concepts, sort of more contemporary concept in evaluation, one of them being transformational change, and the other one, of course, evaluating climate action. So, of course, we always looking for good references, and I think this book presents good methodological reference in itself in this chapter, but it also presents good quotes, reference to other works that have been written. So I think it's going to be useful as we try to make concretely translate the good intentions of the manual into evaluation. I think this is going to be a good important reference. I just wanted to acknowledge this because I think it's really going to be useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. Echoed. Max?
Thank you very much, and well done for the presentation. That is very insightful. And yeah, I have one comment and one question. Let me start with a question. Actually, transformational change is a very broad concept there. And as you have defined it, it's still very broad. And I would like to ask for the general audience, if we want to give keyword to operationalize that concept, what would we say as key in terms of keywords? Because we use it very much in IFAD also. And then sometimes we have been, you are confronted in the situation we need to give concrete operational words that express what it is, yeah? So your contribution will be very, very good. The other point related to fragility situation you rightly highlighted in the presentation. Yeah, it has to take into account the concept, the context where it's come to action, contributing to adaptation. And then we found recently in the evaluation on IFAD support in the Sahel region that there have been successful resilience strategy in those fragile situations. And those success were linked to community-based approach. And in that particular context, yeah, I would like to have, because I have not seen the book, what have been the emphasis of the focus of example you have provided on community-based approaches? So finally, those are two questions. Over.
Thank you very much. I'll stop at this first round and hand over to Juha and Geeta for reactions.
Thank you. Let me start then. Thanks very much for these comments. And I actually on the book, I should say that, you know, this is really essential is to have these books in open access, because it really opens it to audiences, you know, of course everywhere, but also especially in developing countries and especially among students and young people who may not be have the resources to buy these books. Otherwise, this costs a lot, and they are targeted for university libraries and so on. And I just checked this morning, so this book is out for 2 months now. It has been downloaded, or parts of it have been downloaded 27,000 times. Dig that. So anyway, to the substance, and I appreciate these comments very much. And yeah, so Nanti observed that he didn't see very much of this comprehensive holistic approach in any of these evaluations done by any one of our friends, and that is very much true. And I don't know what there must be lots of reasons for it, and we hear them from in our discussions. And one of the things is that simply the fact, I mean, you mentioned the fact that governments are interested in the economic benefits and so forth. So that's a fundamental thing, of course, and organizations evaluating what their primary mandate is. Second thing is that evaluators, we tend to be mostly social scientists, and well, Indran and I are, we are geographers, so we are sort of like edging towards this holistic perspective from that point of view. But I think that it is quite important for us to incorporate in our teamworks expertise in things such as ecosystem functioning and whatever happens to be relevant to that topic, because we often miss that out. And incidentally, there's an interesting, we have this environmental impacts group in the UNEG, which is looking into evaluations and evaluation practice in the organizations. And our group looked into more than 50 evaluations conducted by members, and noticed that there are same mistakes are being repeated in many projects, and these are not, I mentioned unanticipated consequences, but they could have been anticipated if somebody had sort of like understood the system's dynamics and also looked at previous evaluations. So that's kind of a important thing, which brings me to an observation of how evaluation can also contribute to policy making in these organizations, which is that, if people do pay attention to evaluations nowadays. Management does, governments do, donors do, everybody looks into evaluations. So if we improve our practice in evaluations and we bring these kind of issues into the attention in evaluations, even where the project was just concerned with increasing agricultural production or income to the small farmers, if we bring to the attention that, hey, okay, so you may have done that, but at the same time you rendered the poorest of them more vulnerable to climate change impacts, and actually, you encouraged deforestation at the forest edge. So that brings attention to these issues, and we've seen it in the GEF, that then the governing bodies say, okay, but what about this issue? What are you going to do about it? And so it focuses the mind. I don't know, I'm talking too much, but Max's points about transformational change is very well taken, and there are numerous definitions, and it's a vague concept, but I guess the notion there really is the fact that, so sustainable development, we all want to get to sustainable development, but we don't get to sustainable development unless we have transformational change. The context is very important. Geeta may talk more about it. Community-based approaches, which came in her presentation actually this morning. We did an evaluation of GEF's work in fragile and conflict-affected countries, and this is actually a good case in point of how evaluation influences policy. So first, we were questioned that why are you evaluating this? That the GEF doesn't pay any attention to the context. I mean, it was said in a different way, but we don't distinguish whether country is in a conflict or not. We just do our thing. But then we looked at the portfolio, and more than half of the portfolio is in actually countries and situations which are conflict affected or fragile. And the evaluation identified, I don't know, maybe it was 5 distinct pathways through which the conflict affects projected performance. And we presented this evaluation last year, I think, and the Governing Council took the decision that, okay, so now the GEF will have to, in its project designs, pay attention to the context. Okay, I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Geeta.
Thanks, Juha. I think you pretty much got it, but Nanthi, I would suggest, just looking at, having looked at so many projects, I think the one thing evaluators can do is, and we don't normally do this, is actually demonstrate value for money, right, to donors. That these interventions actually generate efficiency gains. The second is systematically look for risks articulated in the projects and how these risks are going to be managed. And so we just looked at, resilience and adaptation in the GEF portfolio, where these were not projects that were exclusively focused on adaptation, but they're environmental projects nonetheless. And you find that the thought being given to building resilience in outcomes to deal with climate change effects was not that strong, but yet these are very positively related with outcomes. And so we demonstrated that planning for resilience and risk mitigation strategies actually have positive associations with outcomes. So looking for these kinds of things and making the case is also educating governments, right? Alongside the other win-win and other solutions. And I think there, when you're presenting solutions, it's to also talk about the synergies and trade-offs. And I think we're also culprits in evaluation where we don't always necessarily evaluate the synergies and trade-offs. And I think that's important, particularly when you're articulating one case over another. So I think that's how I would respond to your concern. On Max's issue of transformational change, it's a common sense concept. It's been known for a long time. It's just the way it's being packaged. We've all known that many of these contextual factors and these other, planning for design, implementation, all are positively associated with outcomes. But I think this gives a framework to say that, look, if you wanted to achieve a really good outcome, to change a sector, to get change at a state level, defining at which level you want this transformational change to be, then you've got to start with proper policy. You've got to have different market forces align. You've got to have, for example, in energy efficiency, you've got to have banks involved. You've got to have a financial sector that's working. You've got to have the SMEs that are plugged in. And only when you have a total system that works together are you going to get this change. And that's why evaluation is also moving towards focusing on a systems approach, right? So look at all these elements in the system. And I think, Nanthi, this also goes back to, these win-win solutions. Is it a partial solution being designed and advocated, or is the evaluation also looking at it from a systems approach to say, these are the different actors that would be impacted and how interventions need to focus on these different parts of the system. And finally, on the community-based approach, absolutely, most of the sustainable land management programs, there was a SLEM, a multi-state project in India. Community-based approaches and participatory approaches are key to success. And even the examples that I showed from Ifad, it's all about involving the community. Otherwise, you're not going to get the desired change, leave alone transformational change. And Fabrizio, thank you. Thanks for participating in the conference. And we've definitely benefited a lot from Ifad's work and Ifad's participation. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. We definitely building up knowledge in this seminar. And, the book has just been released for a few weeks now, and in 27,000 downloads. It's very, very impressive. We most certainly will push it through our platform. We got our own dedicated website coming up in 2 weeks and advance it through all the forums. And I agree with you, Juha. We also want to contribute to the development of the discipline and the knowledge around development and how to evaluate development. It's really, very critical. I'd like, your thoughts on one notion that sometimes comes as a pushback, and that is the program is so complex it cannot be evaluated, right? And then there's a big debate on where the priority goes. But eventually we do make decisions and we make choices in that regard. But I'll open the platform to other colleagues online for any comments and observations. But first, okay, Juha.
Yeah, just reaction to your last thing is, the program is so complex that it can't be evaluated. It's one thing. Then there's the opposite thing is that which we have actually also experienced is that, but you're complicating the evaluation. This is a simple program. But now you are bringing all of these elements here, and this goes beyond our mandate, and it's the evaluation becomes larger than the project itself, and things like that. And obviously that's also in some ways a relevant concern in the sense that, but at the same time, so it's a part of the need for an education that, if perhaps the project is too simple, perhaps it does more harm than good because it hasn't taken these things into account. And yeah, so it all speaks for the fact that we are lucky, both you at Ifad and we at GEF, that we work for internal independent evaluation units where we can actually look at these things. But many other evaluators are constrained by what the program people and the commissioners ask them to evaluate, and therefore it's important to educate, for lack of a better word, people about the need that that evaluation actually has to go beyond to checking, did you do your outputs basically, and hopefully this book and others will contribute to that.
I just like any questions from colleagues here, but some reflection perhaps from the two of you. Now that the conference is over, it was a great event. I was happy to participate. It was more than 2 years ago. And many people, many voices had come in here. Your thoughts on Blue Marble evaluation and your thoughts on this challenge that has been placed to evaluators, that one needs to look at things in a much more, holistic way. And, now that the conference is over, the keynote addresses that were given at that time, this was pre-COVID, has COVID impacted on any of the thinking here? Because I'm at the moment involved in co-editing a book with Pearl Eliadis and Ray Rist, Evaluation in a Crisis, talking about where we have submissions looking at what had happened to the profession during this period. Has it been challenged in terms of other actors moving into the space to provide evaluative information? As an editor, we are looking at various pieces that have come through. But looking back today on that event and the changes that have happened in COVID, do you think it'll have an impact on us as a profession and how we look at issues? Over.
Well, I hope so. I think it's quite important for the evaluators to look in a more broad perspective at these interventions. Like I said earlier already, and Blue Marble evaluation and Michael Patton's work is always inspiring, and it's always quite influential also, because people respect him and he's a great communicator. So one of his he was one of the keynoters in the IDS conference that was at the Parallel, and of course he sang much of his keynote speech, which is something that I can't do. Geeta maybe, she likes the Beatles, yeah. So the thing is, of course, it's easy to talk about these things, but it's harder to put in practice, and it's work in progress, and we we can't do it alone either. We have to engage the program people, and we have to engage the policymakers and so on to understand this thing. I'm thinking of the keynote speakers that were in Prague, and this was in parallel with the IDS conference, so I'm not always sure who spoke for what conference, but Kate Rayworth was there also, and she's the and Melissa. Well, yeah, Melissa Leach. Maybe Kate wasn't there, but Melissa was talking about Kate's work, and she has this notion of donut economics, which is a very appealing notion, where everybody has to fit into this donut ring, and those who go beyond it and who are consuming too much should be brought back into the ring, and those who are in the hole and are not consuming enough should be brought into the ring again. So it's a kind of a equalizer thinking while still focusing on economic principles and so on. And some cities like Amsterdam, I think, are trying to practice it in practice. But it's hard because we still have these 2 billion people that are, according to the World Bank, in absolute poverty, and we know that absolute poverty level is very, very low. So there's many more people who are in less of a absolute poverty, but still in poverty, and just bringing them to, if we use the same models as we have been using now, bringing them to an acceptable level of decent human survival will put a huge strain on natural resources and energy and so on. So we really have to think. We can't just focus on the old-fashioned thinking in evaluation either, about that. Okay, so we were so successful because we lifted this many people out of poverty in this project, but did we do it in a sustainable manner and in a manner that is environmentally sustainable? Really, I think it's important. Let me just, one final thought that came to my mind is that the journal Evaluation has recently, in this latest number that came out last month, has an open access platform piece where Elliot Stern, the editor-in-chief, invited a bunch of evaluators, about a dozen or so, to reflect on what the COP26 meant for evaluation. And there's some interesting viewpoints in that also, and some commonalities and some slight disagreements on how evaluation should deal with the climate change. So, Geeta, any?
Yeah, so Indran, since you said reflecting on the conference, to me, conferences can serve two purposes. One is reinforcing your current mindset and thinking, are you on the right path? And the second is, of course, the generation of new ideas. And I think what at least I took away from that conference was, an even stronger emphasis and need on evaluating the SDGs well. And, we've seen the cake, we've seen the layers, we've seen all that, but they're often presented and then people forget about it. In the GEF context, we brought this back together when we pulled the comprehensive evaluation for this replenishment process together, the road to a green recovery, right? And we are moving towards actually integrating more of environment and socioeconomic co-benefits together. Previously, for the longest time, environmentalists would focus on environment, and development practitioners, it's all about poverty and other angles. It's now, I think the SDGs gave it some thought, and I think it's definitely pushed us in that direction. And we are doing more in bringing together this holistic thing that Juha was mentioning about, and using it as, this is not one versus the other. And it's amazing how we've influenced the mindset of the GEF Council, because now they ask for more on that. So and I think a lot of what you are also referred to, which is on the country context, we've been able to get the GEF Council thinking about the country context more, etc. So I think using these conferences to spearhead our own thinking, our own changes in the way we are approaching different evaluations, then bringing it back to council to influence their mindset and requiring that change in programming directions. So it's kind of this circular thing, and that's where I find these conferences useful. And you and I have been toying with this idea of probably a next one, which focuses even more on integration. And now we know that different areas of the environment are also integrated, right? The whole multi focal area approach, the whole integrated approach, and IFAD's doing a lot of these programs, which brings together environment, socioeconomic, poverty, everything together, and taking the systems approach. What does it mean in terms of the way we think about evaluation, how we conduct evaluation? So I think this, and the other thing is, environmentalists, some think about health outcomes, but at least in the GEF, it was very minimalistic in its thinking about the impacts for health outcomes. And even before COVID hit, we had started looking at how does the chemicals and waste portfolio, for example, affect health outcomes? And then COVID hit, and then we are doing even more on looking at this is clearly related to health as well. So I think it's leading, it's thought-provoking, a lot of the discussions, whether it was the plenaries or the different sessions. So we benefited a lot, and I think the next one would be a good contribution to probably a future volume on looking at evaluating for integration, integrated approaches. Let's stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Geeta, and you are, I think, bringing that part about reflecting from the conference till now links to the broader issue of being reflective in our practice. Many of the best ideas on design are generated in the conferences themselves, because you having this cross-pollination of ideas, and even if it's ideas around which you don't necessarily embrace initially. I know you and I attended the conference, the International Geographers, so the American Geographers Association conference, and getting those perspectives have always been useful, because one of the things that's missing a lot in evaluation is the question of scale. When you start unpacking anything from the international, national to local, you can get quite different results. And it also links to the question of whether one is able to scale up. And we would like to have evaluators think more about the issue of scale. I think the word complexity has been used, and sometimes it's been misused, and there's books being written about it. We know things are complex, but we also know we need to take decisions around that and actually move ahead, which links to a point about when I talk about relativism. One of the things we evaluate is innovation. And often what is portrayed as innovation is just something which is part of a natural change, which should happen, but it doesn't mean you get extra points for that. So also try to impress upon the policy dimension that we should be cautious about not over-affirming the impact of the intervention, because we all work in a context where it's multiple players that are leading to a result, and it's very difficult to tease out who are the players and who contribute to the greatest proportionality of the result, an issue around proportionality. But, thank you again for this very inspiring talk. It's touched at the level of us as professionals. It's also, congratulations again. I also get excited when books come out, because it's the only way in which we can convey and advance our practice. We are a new discipline, relatively so, and each time we write, we are building up the literature for our discipline. And I think it's about time that we also build a literature with new people and new names and new voices. And that's what this book has done. It's brought in people who have not published before, who have not been part of the mainstream, and bringing it in, because then you actually enrich it. I think it's been too much of a club for too long, with the same people saying the same thing and the same keynotes in conferences around. We really look for diversity in this office, and trying to bring in new names and new perspectives. It's overdue for a change. But we wish you all well from Rome, and we also invite both of you, if ever in the region, welcome to our offices for in-person presentations and engagement on a topic or a seminar. Greatly appreciated from my entire team, and also wonderful, Juha, to have been working with you for over a decade now, from way back in UNDP and having conferences around the world. And you too, Geeta, we really appreciate, this interaction. Colleagues, from our end, we thank the presenters greatly. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Indran, for these kind words. And I agree with everything what you say, including the relativity of innovation and so on. And sometimes innovation is just to connect the dots and bring new things into a new, or old things into a new place in a new way. But yeah, obviously, I mean, if we ever are in Rome, we wouldn't miss coming to see you. And actually, as it happens, my last mission, my last trip overseas before the pandemic in February 2020, so was actually to Rome. So I want to come back. But the same to you, and we hope to see you all in Washington, and latest if we get our act together with the next conference. So you will be absolutely invited and to contribute, and we'll see ways how we can collaborate on that too. So thanks. It's been a really pleasurable morning coffee for us and afternoon coffee for you, I suppose.
Thank you, Juha.
On my side too, thank you very much. Thanks for organizing this.
Thank you very much again, and thank you, colleagues. We will get the presentations shared and relevant social media, and look forward to advancing this. Once again, congratulations, and thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.